Order 11448 on January 16, 1969. It may be awarded to any member of the Armed Forces of the United States who distinguishes themselves by either outstanding achievement or meritorious service to the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the presentation of the Meritorious Service Medal. Attention to orders. Citation to accompany the award of Meritorious Service Medal. Master Sergeant Courtney R. Jordan Pelt distinguished herself in the performance of outstanding service to the United States as a non-commissioned officer in charge, Air Force Reserve Officer Training Corps, Detachment 670, Oklahoma State University, Stillwater, Oklahoma. During this period, Sergeant Jordan Pelt's leadership and initiative were vital to the effectiveness and success of the unit. She single-handedly managed $1.5 million in scholarships, fees, and tuition waiver payments for 5 universities. Furthermore, her maintenance of personnel records, security clearances, medical exams, and disenrollments for over 300 cadets served as a strength behind 2 excellent ratings on Headquarters Air Force Reserve Officer Training Corps compliance inspections. Her superior leadership and management expertise were instrumental in the flawless commissioning of 64 second lieutenants into the United States Air Force. During her 2011 deployment to Iraq, she led a joint provincial reconstruction team which ensured the safety of 250 airmen, soldiers, and State Department staff. Sergeant Jordan Pelt's leadership was pivotal to the success of the humanitarian mission and was praised by the United States Ambassador to Iraq. Finally, she served as an exceptional mentor to cadets and cultivated the next generation of Air Force officers. The singularly distinctive accomplishments of Master Sergeant Jordan Pelt culminate a distinguished career in the service of her country and reflect great credit upon herself and the United States Air Force.
This is something that most of you haven't seen or definitely will see in your future as you go through a long, distinguished career, such as Sergeant Jordan Pelt has 23 years, 10 months, 11 months, and 10 days. Did I get those right there? But almost 24 years. That is that's a lot of pain, a lot of pleasure, a lot of active duty time that she's given and devoted herself to the service of the United States. She's not only done that here in the last 5 years with Oklahoma State University, but she's done that on deployments to Iraq and all of her time before that leading up to the culmination of this one event. She didn't want any fanfare. She didn't want to be here today, but again, we remind her that this retirement is not just for her, but it is for the people that helped her get to that point. It means all of you that has tried her patience, made her a better person, and exercising those patience. But without further ado, we'll go ahead and, if you haven't guessed, she's retiring. She's going to be leaving us, so you're going to have all of that expertise. So without further ado, publish the order.
Attention to orders. By order of the Secretary of the Air Force, Special Order AC 010445, Master Sergeant Courtney R. Jordan Pelt is relieved from active duty, Air Force Reserve Officer Training Corps, Detachment 670, Oklahoma State University, Stillwater, Oklahoma. Effective 31 January 2015. Retired effective 1 February 2015. Per Air Force Instruction 36-3203. In the grade of Master Sergeant, and is hereby directed to proceed to her home of selection. In honor of Master Sergeant Jordan Pelt's retirement, we present a certificate from the President of the United States. It reads as follows. I extend to you my personal thanks and a sincere appreciation of a grateful nation for your contribution of honorable service to our country. You have helped maintain the security of the nation during a critical time in its history, with devotion to duty and a spirit of sacrifice in keeping with the proud traditions of military service. Your commitment and dedication have been an inspiration for those who will follow in your footsteps, and for all Americans who join me today in saluting you for a job extremely well done. My best wishes to you for happiness and success in the future. Signed, Barack Obama, Commander-in-Chief. Today's ceremony would not be possible without the support of family and the significant contributions and sacrifices they make, and particularly the military spouse. The Air Force deeply appreciates the supportive role you've taken in Master Sergeant Jordan Pelt's distinguished career and acknowledges your faithful service by presentation of a certificate of appreciation. Kenneth, please come forward and join Colonel Charrington and Master Sergeant Jordan Pelt. Kenneth Jordan Pelt is presented with a special certificate which reads as follows. Certificate of Appreciation from the United States Air Force. In grateful appreciation, this certificate is presented to Kenneth Pelt for the commitment and numerous contributions that made positive impacts to the nation's defense. Thank you for the support which gave strength and purpose to your spouse's service. Signed, Robert D. Thomas, Brigadier General, United States Air Force. And now, Cadet Gabbard would like to present Master Sergeant Jordan Pelt with a gift from the 670th AFROC Cadet Wing.
So sometimes these retirement ceremonies have a tendency to elaborate and kind of exaggerate on people's accomplishments, but it's all true of Master Sergeant Jordan Pelt. She is our resident fixer, lifesaver, and mentor. Speaking from personal experience, she has even given me advice on marriage and career choices and things like that. So with sincerest thanks, this is on behalf of the cadets of Detachment 670 to you.
Thank you, sir. Picture. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in place for some remarks followed by the departure of Master Sergeant Retired Jordan Pelt. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just want to say thank you. I just want to say thank you to all you cadets, as the commander has stated. Y'all got on my nerves, put a smile on my face. Some of y'all have surprised me by excelling to the heights that you have. I appreciate the experience, and I will miss Miss Carol. You too. Thank you very much for all the support, the patience that you've shown during the process when you weren't getting paid or other stuff wasn't happening, the understanding, and that's all I have to say.
Still a Master Sergeant. She's so short.
Thank you.
Once again, please remain standing for the departure of the official party.
afternoon, Assembly. Good afternoon, Cadet Tom. How's everyone doing today? Outstanding, Cadet Tom. Good. All right, you guys can have a seat.
There we go.
So today, we have a very special guest, Colonel Robert Sanders. He served in Vietnam, and he was a helicopter pilot in Operation Ramsong 719. The objective of that mission was to sever the North Vietnamese main routes of logistics, which was in Laos, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So without further ado, I present to you Cadet Sanders.
Whoa.
Present, please.
Whoa.
Colonel Robert Sanders.
Perhaps you'll forgive me for sitting down. My landing gear is not in the best shape in the world, so I'm going to take advantage of this chair. I was reminded this past week when I bought a new vehicle and called the insurance company that I'm getting old. Because they said it was good to have me as a 46-year customer. And it was USAA, and I bought USAA insurance when I was commissioned in Oklahoma State 46 years ago. Time flies when you're having fun. As Cadet Tom said, I spent part of my 25 years in the Army as a helicopter pilot. That was before there was an Army aviation branch within the Army. I split a career between artillery and aviation. And in that aviation part, I had the experience of being in Operation Lamson 719, which was a significant emotional event for me. 42-day operation. We lost 174 aircraft, had another 600 or so incidents of combat damage, and that will leave a little bit of scar on your psyche. But I guess what really prompted me to think more about that operation is when I talked about it after I retired with an old Army friend from the artillery branch. And he had never heard of that operation. So that's when I decided I'd do a little bit more research. And 7 years later, I produced this book, which was published by that university down I-35 south a few miles. I would have offered it to OSU's press, but OSU doesn't have one. But at any rate, I published this book, or they published it, I wrote it. That's an academic piece, it's not an autobiography, and that's how I intended it. I intended for people to understand why this operation was important, even though it failed. From 1958 to 1961, U.S. foreign policy was in absolute turmoil. John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State to Dwight Eisenhower, who had been his strong right hand all through his presidency, was forced into retirement in late 1958 by cancer. And Dwight Eisenhower himself had a very severe heart attack, and he was disabled. And we ran into a situation in our foreign policy in Southeast Asia where we had the State Department going one direction, the Department of Defense pushing a different agenda, and the CIA still going a third direction. So it was a very tumultuous period. But when Kennedy and Eisenhower had their transition briefings at two different sessions, the topic that occupied 90% of their time together was Laos. At that time, there really wasn't a clear indication that there was going to be a war in Vietnam, but there was an overriding concern about the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Now, while you may think that communism, looking back on it, that threat is gone, it seems to be minimized, but put yourself in the mental frame of considering it like ISIS today, okay? It was in the eyes of our policymakers a real and present, clear and present danger. They built their theories around the so-called domino theory. One country would fall right after the other. And if you look at the history of Eastern Europe after World War II, that makes a lot of sense. There was a foundation for this belief. The only difficulty I would have in this particular schematic up here is they've got Vietnam falling before Laos. In reality, I think what my research showed me was that the war in Vietnam was lost in Laos, not in Vietnam. Laos is a landlocked country. It was not a very good place to fight a war, and that's why Kennedy shied away from it and moved to try to gain a neutral status for that country. Was very backwards. Less than 10% of the population was literate. It had no sense of national unity. There were at least 75 to 80 different ethnic groups represented in Laos, the plurality being the lowland Lao. And the rest were scattered hill tribes. About 1.5 million people in this country, vast areas of it basically uninhabited, really tough terrain, dense forest, mountains, jungles, and tribal societies that had not advanced beyond the Iron Age. It served our purposes as a nation to try to neutralize it, make it a neutral country, because there were no Western allies that were willing to participate with the United States in the defense of Laos to roll back the communist effort there. And there was a rightist element, a right-wing element to the Lao government, but they were so incompetent, so corrupt, and so divided that you couldn't build a coalition around the rightists, even though they represented a majority of the significant political figures. So after the 54 conventions in 1959, North Vietnam started making definite plans to take over South Vietnam. Now, historically, you can argue that there never was a united Vietnam before the end of this war. You've got to pick your point in period. All of Southeast Asia was divided up into kingdoms and fiefdoms and colonies that constantly changed over the years. So historically, you can say, well, my historic borders are, but you got to pick your point in history because they changed. So there was infiltration from the north and from the south into Vietnam. Coming through the south, into Cambodia, flowing north, and coming in from the north and going south. And of course, there was the coastline. The insurgency in South Vietnam was totally externally supported. So without the infiltration, the insurgency dies. This is just a relief map of Laos, which will go ahead and emphasize to you a little bit of the rugged aspects of the terrain. Now, if you'll notice in the middle of Laos, in the middle of the Panhandle, the terrain generally sweeps toward Vietnam, flows that direction. That's the direction the ridgelines run. And whenever you're walking through the jungle, that's good to know. Going across compartment over those ridges will kill you. So the natural flow coming down out of the northern part of Laos takes you right toward the Vietnam border. And as you get to that area, there were 3 significant passes that were on the border, and then there was another item called the Chapone Corridor. The Mugia Pass, the Ban Garai Pass, Ban Raving Pass. Those were all passes over the Annamite Mountains that went into Laos and provided access for the North Vietnamese to go into Laos so that they could in turn go south. And they made that determination in 1959. That's where they established their infiltration routes. Now, when you look at that Chapone border a little bit closer, I took this Google Earth shot. You can see how the terrain generally flows in that direction. You generally have accessible terrain between Laos and Vietnam. And shot from a wider angle will show it a little bit more. So going into the early 60s, you have this trend of continuing infiltration down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And at first it's by foot, a very demanding, rugged march. A lot of casualties on the march. Malaria, disease, death, famine, starvation, a real test of human endurance for the communist soldiers that made that trek. And after the 1962 conventions were signed, we, as a nation, had no military representation in Laos. And so our representation there was by the CIA. And we ended up with a proxy army of Laos citizens recruited by the United States. And we actually ended up with two different wars, one in the north and one in the south of Laos. But by 1965, the infiltration down the trail is not to be sufficient enough that entire regiments are now traversing the trail. They improve it every year. Every year they build their roads further that will permit truck traffic. They put in alternate routes. They put in bypasses, all of which are concealed. And by 1965, we have regiments crossing the border from Cambodia into South Vietnam, and that is this particular book. And I know you guys don't have anything to do being college students, but if in your free time, pick that one up and read it. And you'll find that not every American battle was an American victory. We lost many battles in Vietnam. And the second half of this book is one of those battles we lost. The movie that was made of this book only depicts the first half. So you got to read the book to get the truth. I said earlier there were two wars, and they started in 1965. We had the Barrel Roll area in the north of Laos, and we had Steel Tiger in the south. You can see obviously that from a Vietnam War perspective, we had greater interest in Steel Tiger than we did Barrel Roll. However, from the Lao government perspective, they had a greater interest in Barrel Roll because that was the invasion route coming right out of Hanoi to their two capitals. And that's unique. Laos had two capitals. They had a royal capital and an administrative capital. And that became very convenient because that way they could support twice as many coups. You're supposed to laugh at that. But in point of fact, there was one time where they had a coup in progress at both of their capitals by opposing parties. They were not the picture of political stability. Down in the Steel Tiger area, the war developed to be a war against trucks. Okay? It was a war to stop those trucks from running the Ho Chi Minh Trail and making their way down to the base areas where they could go into South Vietnam. And the nature of the Communist Army was it led with its tail. It led with its logistical tail. They had to build up all of their supplies, have them in position, then bring their soldiers in, and then they could attack out of their safe areas, out of the base areas in Laos and Cambodia, and attack in South Vietnam. So it became a war against truck. We had Mr. McNamara's fence, and this is just a seismic sensor. These things were dropped out of aircraft. Navy dropped the first ones. And then they were monitored and had seismic and acoustic sensors and later magnetic sensors. And they didn't work very well. I mean, obviously, because we never did shut down the trail. One of the reasons they didn't operate very well is we used maps, because you gotta go back to the technology of the day. It's map and compass, time, distance, and heading. There's no GPS. And it was not until late 1970 that we found out there were errors of multiples of thousands of meters in the aeronautical charts for Laos. You know, it wasn't like we had a lot of lead time to get ready for that particular war. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was extremely well camouflaged, almost impossible to see from the air. You certainly couldn't see it from a F-4, from a jet aircraft. You're moving too fast. The first person to really give a good description of it was the ambassador to Laos, whenever the commander of the Royal Lao Air Force took him out in a helicopter, and they sat down and got in the Jeep and drove down part of the trail that had been totally trellised on the top, like driving through a green tunnel. Fuel was stored inside caves, caverns. That mountainous region there in Laos is limestone, so it's got a lot of caves and caverns in it. Some of them big enough to hold a major part of the university. There is some of that rugged terrain and karst mountains that I was telling you about. Every year, the trail improved, and every year, the United States forces thought they were making progress on shutting down the traffic. But it never happened. Laos was divided into a wet season and dry season based on the monsoons. There was a presumption on our part that when the wet season came, they quit working on the trail and all activity came to a stop. And then in the dry season, they would pick it up and start all over. The realities are is the communists worked on the trail 365 days a year. And yes, their wet season would slow down truck traffic to a crawl sometimes, but then they would use the waterways. Okay? You can float a lot of supplies down the waterways. So as the effort goes on, what this map will show you there in pink is the area of Laos that was under nominal Lao government control. And I say nominal because it was always the considered opinion of American policymakers that at the point and time of their choosing, the communists in Laos could drive all the way to the Mekong River at will, the western boundary. They didn't do it for political reasons. For them to have done it would have announced to the world that they were in full non-compliance with the 1962 Geneva Accords. It was politically expedient to try to keep some world opinion on their side. The area in blue is a strip that's approximately 20 kilometers deep from the South Vietnam border into Laos, and that is the depth that U.S. Special Operations Groups soldiers can operate. Okay, Special Forces guys. They operated under the acronym SOG, which doesn't take much of a leap to say Special Operations Group from there, but when they got called on that particular acronym, they changed it to Studies and Observation Group, just to be honoring, I guess. And these were small teams, normally 3 U.S. soldiers and 7 to 10 indigenous soldiers, typically tribal soldiers, generically referred to as montagnard, French for mountain people. And at any given time, from 1965 to 1970, you may have had, at best, 5 or 6 of these teams operating in that blue strip. So there's not a lot of military presence there. You've got that air presence because that's all under the Steel Tiger area, but you've got some very severe restrictions imposed by the ambassador to Laos. And you have a built-in conflict then between the ambassador of Laos and the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam. And it really gets to be an ugly chapter in our history. All that area in between those two colored areas, that is contested land. and it is contested land that is controlled at will by the communists. If they want to go into a place and control it, basically they've got the power to do that. So you've got that dead space there where there's really not much we can do effectively to stop the infiltration. Ambassador Sullivan at one time was very optimistic. He at one point indicated that his trail watch teams that he would send out to watch the trails and report were given enough targets to the Air Force that there shouldn't be any trucks left by the end of the year. And you know, the end of the year came, and there were twice as many trucks as there were at the beginning of the year. In 1968, General William Westmoreland, the habitual enemy of William Sullivan, the ambassador in Laos, they really had some contentious meetings, devised a plan called Operations Plan El Paso. And this was a plan to go to Chapone. And if he could get to Chapone, he could cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. If he could get to Chapone at the onset of a dry season and keep it closed for 6 months, he would have the preceding wet season, 6 months, and the following wet season where infiltration would be minimized and give the South Vietnamese an opportunity to get their act together so that they could defend their own country. Great plan, but it called for 5 to 6 divisions. And Lyndon Johnson made his decision on that during the Tet Offensive in 1968. He said, no, we're not going to do that. Now, for you students of history, you know that during that offensive, U.S. forces, Allied forces, had a tremendous military victory. Killed the communists wholesale. They came out of the bushes to fight. It was no longer hit and run. They were there to be shot at. They were there in force, and they died by the thousands. But it turned out to be a psychological and political victory for the communists because our news media reported it as a great disaster. So, great military victory, but we lost all public support. Johnson says, no, we're not going to Chapone. He announces that he's not going to run for office in 1968. El Paso was an air mobile operation on the north front. Let me back up one here. On the north flank. The blue arrows at the north were all going to be air mobiled into 3 different landing zones, all of which coincidentally were deserted airfields. And there was going to be a ground force come up Highway 9. And down at Mount Fine, where you see the red parachute, or my best attempt to make a parachute, that was going to be the ARVN, Army of Republic of Vietnam Airborne Division, that was going to make the drop on Mount Fine. It was probably a pretty decent plan, but a lot of detail went into it. I mean, they went through it, every nut and bolt that was going to be required, how many million tons of gravel was going to be required to turn Highway 9 into a 2-lane road. A well-studied, well-thought-out plan whenever the United States had about 540,000 troops in South Vietnam to help support it. But the political decision was no, we're not going to do that. Now there's the terrain that was involved in El Paso. And you're going to see this later in maps that are laid out in grid coordinates. But that's pretty tough terrain. That's going through the pass. That's why they call it the Chapone Quarter, the Chapone Pass, whatever you want to call it. And this is a plan to go right down the road with ground assault and then support it with air assaults on the north flank. But there you have your results of 1968. You had the Tet Offensive, which, by the way, gives you another high water mark because now you've got North Vietnamese tanks operating all the way down to Highway 9. And you got to think about the logistical considerations. Tanks just don't go off by themselves without a lot of support. maintenance support, fuel support. So now that the enemy is showing the ability to move tanks as far south as Highway 9. You have the political decisions, and along with Johnson's decision not to run, he announces a bombing halt of North Vietnam. All bombing of North Vietnam ended as of 31st of October. It's his attempt to start negotiations. 1968, presidential election year, 31st of October, 2 days prior to the elections. You can make your own argument as to whether or not there was a political motive for the president to make that announcement on the date that he made it. If you were on one side of the aisle, you made a very strong argument that it was a political stunt. And if you were on the other side, you say, no, it wasn't. You can read about this in the State Department files. There's about 500 pages there. And it's generally titled the Anna Chennault Affair. And I will leave that with you, should you want to read it. Anna Chennault was the wife of Claire Chennault. Claire Chennault was the general officer who organized the Flying Tigers during World War II. His wife Anna was Chinese. She was very influential in the China lobby in the United States in that period. Once they had hammered out sort of an agreement with North Vietnam, North Vietnam conceded nothing. They conceded absolutely nothing. The United States unilaterally agreed to halt all bombing of North Vietnam and demanded, but got no acknowledgement of the facts of life agreement. The North Vietnamese never made any attempt to acknowledge that they would agree to these things. The bombing would end, but air Recce would continue. North Vietnam would respect the DMZ, and the attacks on South Vietnam's population centers would cease. And then President Nixon comes to office, and the first thing he get in 1969 is another Tet Offensive. They welcome him to office with another offensive right after he had sent a letter, a peace probe to Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh's answer was another offensive. Then you have we're going to go into this only briefly, but in 1969, April the 15th, there was an Air Force EC-121 shot down in the Sea of Japan by North Korea, about 130 miles off the shore. Nixon wanted immediate retaliation. His Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State drug their feet. He was politically in a position where he couldn't fire him, because he would lose a lot of face if he did it. He couldn't fire his Secretary of Defense because the guy had a lot of clout in Congress. So there was a group put together called the Washington Special Actions Group, chaired by Henry Kissinger. And that was Nixon's way of getting around his cabinet for the rest of his presidency. And that was the rise to power of Henry Kissinger. So a lot of decisions from this point on are going to be out of the normal decision-making mode. 1969 goes on. You have several incidents that continue to drive the war. Battle of Hamburger Hill, you've got a lot of people killed. You have the incident with the EC-121. And the EC-121 incident, according to the diary of his press secretary, who met with Nixon daily, was that the decision to bomb Cambodia was driven directly by the frustration of not being able to do anything about the EC-121 incident in the Sea of Japan. Now that particular incident is pretty close to me because I happen to know that there was a second lieutenant sitting on a missile site on Okinawa. Whenever they made this decision, Nixon made his first decision, they scrambled the Navy Task Force, Task Force 77 to the Sea of Japan. He ordered the battleship New Jersey to join that task force. New Jersey was in the Philippines en route back to the United States from Vietnam. When the New Jersey turned and headed back, it's sort of like that Red October thing. Apparently, the Soviets lost contact with the New Jersey and her flotilla, and they started sending out a lot of recon aircraft to find out where that flotilla was. And they flew into the air defense perimeter of Okinawa, and there was a second lieutenant sitting there with his finger on the switch, waiting to see if the airspeed and horizontal and vertical points in the plane were going to come together where he had to shoot, and wondering whether or not he would go to jail for starting World War III or failing to fire. That was me. So yeah, that kind of sticks in my mind. And it's the same kind of thing, situations that you guys can find yourselves in as a second lieutenant. You can find yourself in some very grave situations in a heartbeat. So never make light of them, and never think that it can't happen to you. Dongapia, a mountain in Ashall Valley, 1969. Pretty hard fight there. About 260 American casualties total, not all of them were KIA. And Life magazine rolled up all the casualties in Vietnam for 1 week and made the assumption that presented them in such a manner that they all happened at Hamburger Hill, and that created a real public uproar. And so that is followed by the decision to Vietnamize the war, to turn the war over to the South Vietnamese. 1970, instability in Cambodia. Cambodia had severed relations with the United States back in the early 60s and was harboring the North Vietnamese and doing an arms trade and rice trade with them. There was a coup in Cambodia. The guy that took over closed the port. Remember the port where they came up from the south? Cuts those supplies off, and Nixon tells the communists through a CIA agent, I've got the documents and I refer to them right here, and we'll give you the quotes. He instructed his director of Central Intelligence to go through the agent network and tell them in the way of a leak that we are going to attack you if you don't turn around and end your assault on the new Cambodian government. So, needless to say, they were forewarned when this operation was launched in 1970. Now, this operation really hurt the communists bad. It shut down the southern end of their infiltration routes and seized a lot of supplies. But it also led to this little incident right here. Does anybody recognize the picture?
K-State?
That's what?
Is that K-State?
That's Kent State. The governor of Ohio called out the National Guard after protesters at Kent State torched which building?
ROTC building.
The ROTC building. Okay? And the National Guard was not the best trained unit in the world because during that era. Unlike today, the National Guard was your way out of the circle. Okay? National Guard and Reserve, that equated to, hey, I don't want to go to Vietnam. And if you had influence, if you had pull in local politics, if you knew somebody, you could get a slot in the Guard and Reserve and be immune from the draft and not have to go to the bush in Vietnam. Well, what a wonderful deal. But as a result, they weren't real well trained. And certainly not well disciplined. Concurrent with the operation in Cambodia, there was another operation that flies under the radar for most Americans. It was Texas Star, up on the north end of Vietnam in the Ashall Valley. The Ashall Valley is part of South Vietnam, but it was also part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was placed in South Vietnam that we were never able to dominate. We could go in there, we could clean it out, we could get a lot of people killed in the process, we could kill a lot of them, but the topography, the terrain, and the tactics wouldn't allow us to stay there, and then we left, they were back. And after having been burned at Hamburger Hill, the 101st Airborne Division was not particularly receptive to having a lot of press up there for that next operation. And that operation terminated with an event called Ripcord, Fire Sport Base Ripcord. And that was a display of the pure determination of the North Vietnamese to hold critical ground. And they forced the 101st Airborne Division out of there. Last major land battle of the Vietnam War. And we were fortunate to get out of there, not losing any more people than we did. Okay, any questions at this point? Okay. If you're going to read about Texas Star and Ripcord, there's the book you read. And that particular author, Benjamin Harrison, he was kind enough to review and endorse my book. And while he doesn't say much in here, it's extremely important to understand that he was one of the few American general officers that was actually involved in Operation Lamson 719, which is to follow. Okay. 1970. This is the letter put out by the communists to their people in the field. Go ahead and take a look at it and read it for just a second. Because the issue is going to be the element of surprise. Did we lose the element of surprise when we launched Lamson 719? No, we didn't lose it. We never had it. They expected it. It was logical. It was, just bare logic. That's what the United States is going to do. They're going to make a stab at Chapone. Okay. Nixon ordered his staff to plan an offensive Operation Laos in May 1970, and that was followed with some irregular force operations by the CIA in Laos. Now, interestingly enough, whenever I talk to my CIA historians and my contacts there in my other research, I say, what about Operation Gauntlet? And they give me that Texas A&M salute. They've never heard of it. They've never heard of it. And the reason they haven't heard of it is because Gauntlet was planned at the Washington level. And then it was broken down into smaller operations when it went to Laos. Okay. Now that took a fair amount of time and research for me to figure that out. In fact, about the best part of the last year of sorting through CIA message traffic, which they're a little bit grumpy about giving out. So we start this operation called Lamson 719. We're going to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we're going to do it with ARVN, South Vietnamese soldiers, and they're going to be supported by U.S. Army helicopters. Now, the reason there's not going to be any U.S. ground forces involved is, first of all, we've got the Vietnamization program going, and not most, but a big part of the ground forces, the Army's already been withdrawn. Secondly, Congress passed a law and said you cannot use any of your defense money to support a soldier on the ground in Laos or Cambodia. Not even an advisor. Okay? But there's a little loophole in there, that says, helicopter pilots can go. They can do that because they're not on the ground until they get shot down. So I recall one of the more idiotic things I had to do was sign a statement saying I wasn't going to get out of my helicopter. But you do. When you get shot down. Okay. Harry Reasoner, another broadcast journalist, had this to say. On the 16th of February, right after we started Operation Lamson 719. Give me a second to read that. What do you think? Is that helicopter repairable? With enough money. And that's a good answer, because that's going to become a key point later on, whenever we start trying to figure out what the actual total is. Okay, as we go through the rest of this, I'm going to just give you a brief description of the helicopters. I may call them this is a UH-1. I may say Huey, may say Slick, may say lift ship. It's all the same. Cobra, Snake, gunship. First designed helicopter designed strictly as a weapons platform. This particular one, if you can read it, is tail number 002. It was called by the troops in Delta 158 Balls Deuce. Balls Deuce has a lot of significance to me because in 2010 I went to the funeral of the last two people to fly Balls Deuce. And that was when their remains were recovered. Charlie model. This is the early vintage gunship. It's a utility helicopter configured as a gunship. Terribly underpowered, not up to the job in Laos. You could count measure the progress of Lamson 719 by the wreckage of the Charlie models on the ground. It was just that great. The Chinooks picked up aircraft and recovered them. The cranes were used for heavy lift, howitzers, bulldozers, large ammunition supplies. And the OH-6, the Lopes, one of my personal favorites because it was just so damn much fun to fly. And it was sort of the sports car of helicopters. The biggest deficiency was it could outfly most of the pilots that got behind the controls, and so you had a lot of accidents. It could get ahead of you in a hurry. I won't bother to tell you the war stories about it, but just take my word. It could outfly you. Okay, the plan is for Lamson, as briefed in Washington, looked a lot like El Paso. In fact, it was just El Paso all over again. The only difference was instead of having 5 or 6 U.S. divisions, we're going to do this with parts of 3 South Vietnamese divisions, part of the Airborne Division, part of the 1st Infantry Division, and part of their Marine Division. And we're going to throw in the Corps Ranger Group while we're at it. But it's briefed 5 times in Washington from the 18th of December until kickoff on the 8th of February, and it's briefed the same way every time. Infantry division's going in, they're going to go down that highway, they're going to take the objective at the midway point, objective A. Louis, and once they get to A. Louis, the Airborne Division's going to make a hellborn assault, and they're going to seize the airfield at Chapone, and then everybody's going to go to Chapone. We're going to have a big party at Chapone. We're going to radiate out from there, and we're going to destroy this huge supply complex that is at the hub of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was briefed that way 5 times. Okay? You got to think about that. Slight modifications each time, but that's the way it was briefed. The first phase was going to be Dewey Canyon. Dewey Canyon 2. In order to open that road up going to Quezon, the enemy will know something's up whenever we start flying in all those culverts and repairing all those bomb craters. But we're going to tell them that we're going to make a sharp left turn and go down to the Ashaw Valley, just like we did in 1969 in Dewey Canyon 1. So they used a lot of code names, and that was supposed to deceive the enemy. But you remember the message that went out to the field. Okay. If you look at most of this is a really lousy slide because it's blurry. But if you look at all your contemporary histories of this operation, there's what you see for an operational graphic, and it's absolutely nonsense. Okay? It was never planned like that. That may be what happened in phases, but this is absolute nonsense. When you see that graphic in an article you're reading about Lamson 719, just close the book, because whoever wrote it doesn't know what they're talking about. Okay, as executed on the 8th of February, here's what you have. You have part of the infantry division down on the south flank. You got one brigade, one regiment. Okay, actually in this case, and in fact it's a regiment minus. You've got a brigade minus of the airborne division up on the north, and you've got a corps ranger battalion all the way on the far north. Now, what have you done to your operation? Some of you Army guys tell me.
Sir, it's overbalanced in the north. Right.
Yeah.
You're putting your best troops on the periphery where they should be in the center.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Anybody else? Okay, let me break it down another way to look at it. Before, you had one division going down and securing both sides and taking Objective A Louis. That's all under one division commander's control. Now you've got 2 division commanders involved in that operation, plus you've got the Ranger group that is a corps asset that answers directly to the corps commander on the far north. You've complicated your operation. You've increased your coordination problems tenfold. Okay? Now this doesn't readily pop out at people. And you'll see people say, well, you know, that poor Vietnamese Corps commander, he had never operated with a corps in the field before. That's true, because it was basically the Corps headquarters, it was basically the administrative headquarters. Well, he damn sure hadn't operated with divisions on line instead of divisions in column. As far as that goes, Creighton Abrams, U.S. commander in Vietnam, had never done that. So now a plan has been approved and put into action that is more complex than probably the U.S. senior commander in Vietnam could have handled based on his experience of, because we'd never operated 2 divisions on the line, since the Korean War. This is a significantly complex operation. Not only that, the Highway 9 we're talking about, that we're going to drive that armored task force down, it's got all these cuts in it. And they showed up in air wrecking, but nobody read the photographs. They assumed that those were little ditches that they could just sort of, drive over, maybe flop a culvert down in or something like that. Those are full-size combat vehicles down there on that road. Those aren't little ditches. And when it rains, they're impassable. Okay? And it does have a tendency to rain in this part of the country. In fact, that's day 2 of the operation. Okay? Warrant Officer 2, Bobby Gentry, was flying that particular helicopter. He died about 2 hours after that picture was taken. This was sort of typical of what Khe Sanh looked like during the operation. This was so-called dry season, but you got to remember, dry season, wet season, that's all relative. Khe Sanh was one of those environments where you could have rotors blowing dust in your eyes and have mud on your boots at the same time. Weather had a very serious impact. You just couldn't operate like you thought you could want to operate. Okay. Does anybody know what density altitude is?
It's basically when you have non-standard temperature, it changes your altitude based on temperature.
Yeah, it changes the characteristics of the atmosphere that provide lift to an airfoil. The higher the density altitude, the less lift an airfoil will generate. The more power it takes to fly. Density altitudes were high. Okay? You constantly found yourself in a position, if you were in Cobra, which had the biggest engine of the gunships, where you couldn't load up all the fuel that you would really like to load up. Otherwise, you'd have to start cutting back on your rockets and 20 millimeter ammunition, 40 millimeter ammunition. So you have to cut your fuel. If you're flying one of those old Charlie models, you had to cut it on both ends. You had to cut your fuel and your armament. And in fact, at Khe Sanh, true story, I have seen, or I saw, I witnessed Charlie models trying to take off. And a lot of helicopter pilots will do this. They take a running takeoff, okay? Just pull enough power to get light on the skids, start sliding down that grass. And when you get to about 18 knots of forward airspeed, what do you get? You get translational lift, a little bonus lift, because your rotors are now performing like a solid airfoil. So you got more lift, and my gollies, if you get down there to the end of the runway where it drops off the cliff, when you drop off, you can pick up enough airspeed to get enough lift to get airborne. Everything works out just right. But to do that, the crew chief and door runner are running alongside the helicopter. Because if they jump on, that's another 400 pounds. I mean, they're wearing flak vests, they're carrying weapons, they're probably weighing 160, 170 pounds apiece. 400 pounds, that makes a lot of difference. So, crew chief and door gunner are running alongside just as fast as they can. When the helicopter's bouncing along about as fast as they can run, they jump on. And when they're coming out of POL point, they got these big 3-inch POL pump lines laying out there, and they can't get over it. But they can pull enough power that the crew chief and door gunner can get out on either side and pick up the side of the helicopter and walk it over to the other side. It seems kind of ridiculous, but that's what we were operating against, and that's why you had a lot of Charlie models that were deemed dead, that were lost. 12th of February. Now, going back to that original plan was that we're going to go down there to Aloi, and as soon as we get to Aloi, which was also the name of the town in the Ashall Valley, that was supposed to fool the enemy, when they named the village of Bandong Aloi. When we get down there to Aloi, we're going to do that in one day. Not very far across the border. We're just going to blast on down there, and then the airborne assault's going to go on Chapone, and then the ground assault's going to fight its way through, and we're all going to get together at Chapone and really kick some butt. But the South Vietnamese got to Aloi, and then they stopped. Okay? They stopped. They stopped moving. Part of it is weather. Okay? The weather's not really cooperating real well. They've had a lot more rain than they expected. That Route 9 that they were planning on using as a main supply route is a quagmire. They can't get anything to move over it. So all the resupplies have to be done by helicopters. So you put all this additional burden on your helicopter fleet. And it's just not your cargo helicopters or utility helicopters, because this is like Noah's Ark. Nobody goes anywhere without a pair of gunships following them. They will die. They will die immediately. There's people getting shot down wholesale during this period of time. There are people puking their guts out in the morning before they climb on that helicopter and take off. Okay? I can't express to you in terms that I really feel are adequate, that you can understand what's going on here with the air crews. And the other thing you got to understand, and that's particularly important for a leadership class, is those air crews are junior officers and warrant officers. Okay? The Army at this time does not have a history in aviation. They've been flying helicopters in Vietnam since 1961, and it's now 1971, but we don't have 10 years of experience flying helicopters in Vietnam. What we've got is the experience of 10 one-year tours. Okay? Your senior officers, the guys that are making these decisions, some of them are wearing wings, pilot wings. And some of these guys got their wings while they were assigned to the Pentagon. They had a VIP version of flight school. A warrant officer instructor pilot would fly up to their quarters at Fort McNair and say, "Sir, are you ready for your lesson today?" "No, sir." "Well, I'll come back tomorrow." Okay. And that's where they'd get signed off on their wings. And that was the limit of their experience in planning air mobile operations. And that's why we ended up with a lot of Charlie models being involved in this. But back to the point, the South Vietnamese stopped moving. Now, Philip Davidson who wrote a book called Vietnam War, which is probably the most authoritative book on the total war that I've had the experience of reading, because he was the J2 for both Westmoreland and Creighton Abrams, and he knew what he was talking about. If you read your history carefully and you read between the lines, you'll know that we had the South Vietnamese president's office wired for sound. We knew what was going on in his office. And it made sense that we needed to know what was going on in his office. And we know that South Vietnamese president told his field commander, he says, I don't want you taking any more than 3,000 casualties. Okay, now that's not killed, that's just, wounded and killed, total. And when you get to 3,000, stop, turn around and come home. So they got that far and they stopped and they just sat there. The longer they sit there, the more opportunity the North Vietnamese have to do what? Concentrate their forces and start picking off these remote locations one at a time. So they sit there. That's Bay Louie from the air, by the way, just thought I'd throw that in. And the 16th of February, Creighton Abrams and General Vane from the South Vietnamese High Command come up and they say, okay, we've got to come up with a new plan. We can't go down Highway 9 and go all the way to Chapon. For one thing, there's North Vietnamese tanks that are blowing our stuff away when we try to move down that highway. And their tanks were bigger than our tanks. And that was another nasty surprise. So we're going to go down this South Ridge line. And we'll go down to these fire bases, Lowell, Liz, Sophia, Hope, and then on into Chapon. And that sounds like a real good idea. And so that's the new plan. In the meantime, the South Vietnamese start making pretty good progress down here on Route 914. They have one battalion that moves up here a pretty good distance, really taking care of business as they go. But it's just one battalion, and they don't reinforce that success because we're going to try to stick right up here. We're not going to be flexible. We're not going to change where opportunity has given us a chance. We're going to make this assault down this side of the ridge line. By the way, this is all dense jungle. So the Air Force come in and drops 10,000 pounds bombs for us with fuse extenders, and we'll blow these fantastic landing zones with these commando vault bombs. It's a good idea. It's a good theory. But that's going to go to the hell in a handbasket as we go on. So there's that plan in just a little bit more detail, so you can get closer into it and you can see it. That's on the 16th of February. But 18th through 20th February, the North Vietnamese have now isolated Ranger North. That Corps unit does not respond to either one of those two Army Division commanders down there. They respond directly to the 3-star Corps commander, General Lamb. And they call in on the 19th, and the boss is busy. He's in a meeting. And they say, tell the boss we'd kind of like to leave. We're about to be overrun here. Their initial mission was not to defend. It was to go out there as a screening force. But they couldn't withdraw until they had permission. But the boss was in a meeting, so he never does reply to them. Things get a little sticky out there at Ranger North. Well, while they're out there, medevacs are flying in, and supply ships are coming in, and it's a battle getting in and out every time because they're totally ringed with air defense guns. And Specialist 5 Dennis Fuji is a medic on medic and a crew chief, dual-handed on a medevac helicopter, and he goes in to make him and his pilot and crew to go into Ranger North to start some evacuations. And Warrant Officer Brown, the pilot, is en route out there. He's got a pair of snakes, spare gunships escorting him, and they start taking all sorts of fire. Can't get in. The medevac chopper's hit. Okay. Fuji knows it's hit. He can hear the whistling in the motor blades. He can see the holes as he looks around the cockpit. And so he makes the decision, can't do it, we're not going in, we're gonna turn back, we've gotta get some more suppression before we can get in. So his escort guns say, Roger, we're turning back. Everybody turns back, heads back to Caisson, then Brown does a 180 and says, the hell with it, I'm going back. And he goes in and doesn't tell, he turns around, doesn't tell his two gunship escorts. Well, needless to say, he gets his butt shot down. And Fuji's on the ground, along with the rest of the group. Brown gets killed on the spot. He's trying to get a radio out, run and take it to the bunker so they can have something to communicate with. And he gets shot and killed. But the rest of the crew makes it into a bunker, but Fuji ends up in a separate bunker, one off on the other side of the aircraft. So here comes the rescue helicopter. And it comes in, making the landing. Everybody runs to get on the rescue helicopter. The three people that were in one bunker and Fuji's in the other one. And just as Fuji steps out of his bunker, a mortar round hits right in front of him, blows him backwards, and he's momentarily unconscious, laying back in that bunker. Helicopter takes off with that. Can't stay there. So Fuji's on the ground. And there isn't getting anybody in there. I mean, it's now impossible to get anybody in to get him out. So Fuji just became part of the 39th Ranger Battalion at Ranger North. And the American voice on the ground. Okay? All this time in the war, up to this date, the Air Force has been able to talk to an English-speaking American. I mean, he might have even spoken, but he was generally understandable. But now, those forward air controllers are having to talk to Vietnamese commanders. There's a little bit of a language problem. And so air-ground communications is really tedious at best. But now you've got an American voice on the ground, and there's a natural tendency, like it or not, that Americans are going to work harder to save other Americans. So you get that added sense of urgency, and for 2 days, Dennis Fuji fights the battle of Ranger North, calling in airstrike after airstrike, controlling AC-130s, AC-119s. He is a hero, okay? So his time comes on the 20th. Get out, Ranger North is seriously being overrun now. So here comes another rescue ship in, picked up good old Dennis Fuji. Dennis jumps on that sucker, and Charlie Company 158th Aviation Battalion, Captain David Nelson Fox, at the controls, takes off from Ranger North, just barely gets his skids off the ground. He gets shot up. Helicopter bursts into flames, and he auto-rotates into Ranger South. They made it about 1.5 kilometers or 2 kilometers, whatever it was. And Fuji's on the ground again. Okay. And so he's down at Ranger South the next day, and he's still doing the same thing. He's now fighting the battle for Ranger South. Ranger North has already been overrun. And he's doing the same thing he was at Ranger North. He's the head guy for bringing in the air. And another helicopter comes in to pick him up, and he runs out to get on it. And they take off. He gets shot down again, but he makes it a little bit further south. He makes it down to Fire Support Base 30, but on impact, he knocked himself out, and when the rescue ship comes in, he's not on it. I just thought I'd throw that stuff in about Fuji because it becomes important later on to understand that American voice on the ground. Now, as we talk about this operation, and we talk about secret war, the Lao Proxy Army, the surrogate army of the United States, those Lao citizens who were recruited by, trained by, and commanded by the United States government are now involved in this operation, and there's very few people that are students of Lamson 719 that understand this. They ran these two operations here, Desert Rat and Silver Buckle, and took a hell of a lot of casualties in the meantime because those operations were timed so as to support the advance on Chapone, which did not happen because the South Vietnamese stopped. Okay? And there was another operation which I cannot decipher. I can find only one reference to it. It was called Operation Oklahoma City. And the only reason I know it existed is because Operation Oklahoma City was canceled by Henry Kissinger after getting a request from the ambassador of Laos, who wanted to take the troops destined for Oklahoma City and send them to the royal capital of La Prabang, because La Prabang was at risk of being overrun. Here's some of those soldiers. Okay, these guys all live down in Tulsa. These are Hmong. They come from that war in the north. Some of them look pretty young to be Vietnam vets. Don't you agree? Well, some of them were pretty young whenever they became vets, because by 1971, the Hmong had been so decimated that they had 14, 15-year-old kids in the ranks. Okay, some of them were pretty young. This is one that I just referred to as the Elder Pashong. He joined the CIA's secret army in 1960. He stayed with it until the war ended for Laos in 1975. His wife was in that fight with him. She served as a medical attendant, and in her free time, she sewed uniforms. This fellow right here was a heavy weapons specialist. Stands about 5'4". You can tell by the way he's got the sleeves rolled up in his BDUs. He's not too big. And this little guy is humping the base plate to an 81 millimeter mortar up and down the mountains in Laos. Tough little guy. This gentleman right here, he was known as a commando raider. 7 or 8 man teams, all parachute qualified. Dropped or inserted deep into the Ho Chi Minh Trail just to go raise as much havoc as 8 or 10 men could raise whenever you're faced with the security force of the trail that's normally running 20,000 people. Hit and run tactics. Hit once and do a whole lot of running afterwards. Here's some more of your secret warriors. The man with the crutches, his name is Simi. He's low and loud. He lives in Connecticut. He's double amputee below the knee. Stepped on a landmine. The man standing next to him is Sarah Polsack. Sarah served in the secret army from 1961 to 1983. Okay. Now, a lot of you didn't know that war went on past 1983. It did for these guys. It didn't end for those guys until sometime after 1983, because the communists were bent on total extermination of everybody that had served with the SGU, the Special Guerrilla Units. Okay, back up one here. Now, I want you to guess, how much VA benefits do these guys receive?
0.
Absolutely right, 0. You feel good about that?
No.
I don't either. It's never going to change. I can tell you that. There's too many people trying too hard for too many years to get that change, and so it'll probably never change. Simi here has about $600 a month to live on. He lives in a second-story walk-up apartment. He's double amputee. He lives based on the charity of his fellow WOW soldiers that live in his area. SAR, the man right next to him, my first introduction to that community, was well taken care of whenever he came out of Thailand, as it were, because he was withdrawn to Thailand and he worked the Thai-Lao border doing things with radios that we're not supposed to acknowledge. And but he was well taken care of when he came back out of Vietnam or Laos, because he had carried a letter from the ambassador that says, "This is a good man, give him a job." And they asked him where he wanted to go, and he said, "California." And they said, "No, you don't want to go to California, you want to go to Connecticut." And SAR always followed orders. "Yes, sir, I want to go to Connecticut." And, why do I want to go to Connecticut? Well, you want to go to Connecticut so you work at Colt Firearms Factory. Okay. It all made sense to him. And so he carried his letter. He went back to Colt Firearms Factory, and they directed him down the hall to the personnel guy, and he walked in the door, and the guy looked at him and said, "Sorry, don't you remember me?" Sorry, I didn't recognize him, but it was the guy that was his trainer in 1961, a Special Forces soldier in 1961. And hooked him up with his old boss. Okay, back to Lamson. By the 23rd of December, we are in major trouble with aircraft availability. We have been shot to pieces. Not only have we been shot to pieces, we're flying helicopters more hours than we can maintain. You know, you've got a thing called a sortie generation rate. How many sorties can you generate based on the aircraft you have, the maintenance you have, the parts you have, and that's a fixed number. And you know, there's just not a whole lot that you can do to improve on that, and we're exceeding our sortie generation rate. And in some outfits, the availability of aircraft goes all the way down to zero. Everything they have is grounded, shot up, shot down, whatever. And this catches Creighton Abrams by surprise. Because Creighton Abrams is sitting in his office down in Saigon, because his first priority, the task he's been given by his boss, is Vietnamization, get the U.S. forces out of South Vietnam. He's not running this operation. This is a South Vietnamese operation. Just happens to have U.S. Army helicopter pilots involved. So we end up drawing helicopters from all over South Vietnam, sending them up there wholesale as replacement, and red balling them out of the depots here in the States in order to get things flying. And as I said earlier, the Charlie models just died like flies. Now, one of the reasons the Charlie models died like flies is the Charlie model units all came from down south. They didn't come from I Corps in Vietnam, there in that resident area. They came from down south where the terrain was different, the threat was different, and while they were experienced, they were not experienced in this kind of environment, and they really took a basting. And from my perspective as a pilot, that's one of the great sins, is that senior officers made that decision to send Charlie models to that environment when a W-1 warrant officer 1 with 6 months in country could have told them that's a stupid idea to do that. Okay, so Ranger North Falls. When Ranger North falls, Ranger South is abandoned and told to move down to Fire Support Base 30. By that time, North Vietnamese have gathered in on Fire Support Base 30 and 31. And now the entire northern flank is about to collapse. Okay. On the 25th of February, 1971, at about 1600 hours in the evening, Fire Support Base 31 is under a tank and infantry attack, tank-supported infantry attack. And the Air Force is killing tanks wholesale. Bam, bam, bam. Doing a good job. For the boys in blue. Then one of the boys in blues gets shot down in an F-4. And the entire Air Force effort immediately stopped and reverted to SAR, search and rescue operations. Okay, and the tanks just kept on coming, and Fire Support Base 31 was overrun. That night, whenever they had their commanders meeting, the Airborne Division commander was a little testy about that event, and his division advisor, Colonel Bill Pence, supported it. He said, yeah, that really wasn't very cricket for the Air Force to decide that rescuing their F-4 crew was more important than saving the brigade headquarters and 1 battalion of the Airborne Division. 500 or 600 men as compared to 4. Where do you put your priorities? Well, when Bill Pence supported that, he made the mistake of supporting it where there was a reporter present and was hurt. And he was fired immediately, relieved immediately of his command. And Ben Harrison, who was the division senior advisor to the infantry division, then became dual head. He was senior advisor to both divisions. Now, you'll find a replay of this incident a year later. Okay? And it's important for everybody to understand what I'm saying. What I'm telling you is that we had decisions, we made decisions that were based on ethnocentristic values and behaviors. We were all guilty of it, okay? You gotta recognize it, and you gotta understand that part of our heritage and our history. Because a year later, anybody ever see the movie Back to One? Okay. A couple guys saw it right there. Well, Back to One was a navigation officer in an ED-66. And he got shot down right over the DMZ, right close to the Camo Bridge during the Easter Offensive in 1972, when the whole damn North Vietnamese army is lined up in tanks and charging south. And they're all wanting to come across that bridge right there, because it'll get them right down to Quang Tri. But Hamilton gets shot down, and he's right there, and there is a sergeant first class in the basement down in Saigon, empowered to invoke a no-fire area around any downed airport. And it's just not a little bitty no-fire area, it's 25 kilometers in radius. Okay? You take a 25-kilometer radius circle and lay it down by the Cam Lo Bridge in Vietnam, and it covers most of the DMZ. So that goes in there. No fire, no naval gunfire can go in there. U.S. Air Force is not going to strike in there, and any artillery under U.S. control is not going to fire in there until they get that pilot out. Meanwhile, you've got NPA divisions coming through that gap. And there's a guy by the name of Turley, Marine Lieutenant Colonel, who just happened to be in the area whenever that assault broke down and became the impromptu advisor to a Vietnamese Marine brigade that was up there. And the vice commander of that brigade looked at him and held up one finger. One, we're doing this for one man. Okay. And the answer was yes, we're doing this for one man. Okay, now that part's not covered in the movie. Read the book. You can also read Turley's book, The Easter Offensive, or you can read Gerald Whitcomb's book, Rescue of Back to One. Okay. So now we made this plan. On the 16th, we revised that plan. We're getting ready to crank it up on the 28th of February, and General Lamb, who's facing constant contact with his boss, President Chu, flies down to Saigon to confer with President Chu. That's his commander-in-chief. And President Chu says, no, I says, I don't like that plan. We're not going to send my airborne brigade to Chapon. The reason we're not going to send my airborne brigade is it's one of my elite divisions. What that translates to is that's part of my palace guard. It's part of the force that guards me from being overthrown by a military coup. We're not going to do that. You can send one of those Marine regiments that's up there. Well, they're not in position and they're not ready to go. So we run into a delay, and in the meantime, General Abrams finds out about it. He goes up there and to the presidential palace. He argues with him. He says, "Okay, if we can't use the airborne brigade, let's take a regiment of the infantry division and we'll put them in there." So they decided to do that. Meantime, it's all been delayed. But when General Lamb left to fly down to Saigon, he left his last instructions, and his last instructions include where we're going to put this B-52 strike to support this operation to the first of these LZs, LZ Lobo. He says, right here, that's where I want it. Gives the grid coordinates. Okay. And, by the way, we need to go ahead and drop a couple of these commando vault bombs. Make these big LZs. Well, that's sort of like saying, knocking on the door and say, "Here I come." Whenever you put that thing in there, you pretty well triggered your intentions. But now we got all these changes of plans going on. Commando vaults went in, the plan went in to the Air Force, not just to the 7th Air Force, but all the way back to the Strategic Air Command, because we don't have a unified chain of command in Vietnam. We've got the Army, we've got the Air Force, we got 7th Air Force, we got 2nd Air Force, but that's not SAC, okay? B-50 crews are controlled by SAC, you know, back in the States. So, we've got this plan now, and we're gonna make this lift on Lolo on the 3rd of March. And instead of taking off from a secure pickup zone back in South Vietnam, we're going to pick up those infantry troops where they're at the field at Fire Support Base Delta. And there's a guy by the name of Jesse Diaz who is making that lift, and he gets his butt shot down on his way to the PZ, on his way to the pickup zone. He said, you know, his comment was, it's a little like getting thrown out of the ball game before you enter the stadium. So, you know, this is not getting off to a good start, this lift on Lolo. And there's Lolo 2 days after the lift. Those gray spots, those are the ashes of burned up helicopters, okay? The ones that burned. Now, some of them didn't all burn. And if you look at the top of the screen and have really good eyes, you can see a Chinook at the top, and he's drifting in with a howitzer. He's getting ready to set it down. There's a little bit of violet smoke blowing up there because that was going to be a fire support base. But we lost a lot of helicopters in a real hurry up here at LZ Lolo. And it was the first day that we had a general officer to be the commander of the air assets, because Abrams had discovered all these problems, and now he wants to command attention on the aviation operations. And Brigadier General Sidney Berry is now the Lamson 719 aviation officer. And if you look him up in the flight school records, you'll find out he never did go to flight school. But he had wings. Okay. And they put this lift in at Lolo, and it was absolutely horrific. And I show you this picture for one reason. I didn't go to Lolo myself. Two very trustworthy people that I trust and believe have given me the same testimony in separate occasions, in separate rooms, and separate venues. And they said that the field fortifications that were on Lolo, the ones dug by the North Vietnamese, were freshly turned earth. Okay? Should have been clearly visible to the air cavalry whenever they recon the LZ. Okay? But there was no report of field fortifications that went to the lift ships. Okay? So, did the air cavalry miss them? Or did they recon a different area? Okay? I can't tell you for sure. I think they reconned a different area, because buried in the bowels of the duty logs of the 14th Aviation Battalion, there's an entry 3 days later that gives grid coordinates for Lolo that are about 1,000 meters south of where they ended up. And guess where the arc light strike went? 1,000 meters south. So, did we land at the wrong location? Or did we miss, Air Force? Did you miss it by 1,000 meters, or did we land at the wrong location? You guys can take your choice. I think the guys at Blue all say that Army went to the wrong location, and the guys at Green say the Air Force missed. But I can't tell you. That's Lolo in about 1994. And you can see the trees and stuff still haven't grown back on it. This picture was taken by a guy that was back there doing service recovering bodies and doing the archaeology. But it gives you a unique perspective of looking down off that escarpment that's on that south rim. That's really difficult country. After they land at Lolo, they go to Liz and then Sophia and then to Hope. And once the 2nd ARVN Regiment gets up there to Hope, they make a pass at Chapone. And the only reason they're doing that at this point is because President Chu had screwed up early in the operation and announced to the world that his army was going to Chapone. And so now it's a matter of, I've got to save face. I've got to go up and play tag with the city limits side. And that's really about all they did, is they swung up and played tag on the city limits, but they never crossed to the west side of that Lang Hang River, which is where the main supply area is at. They never made that crossing. city limits, crossed the Sapone River, went back up to Sophia and said, you know, call it a day. It's time to go to the house. So after spending a week or so trying to exploit the area south of Chappone and east of Chappone, but avoiding that area, the lucrative area that was to the west of Chappone, they decided it's time to head up and leave. And by that time, every fire base in Laos, every one of our fire support bases is under pressure. And all the ones on the north flank are gone. And the North Vietnamese have moved in absolute force. And up here at Lolo, Lolo is the last of those new bases that's going to be abandoned. And the 4th Battalion is going to fight the covering force battle. 4th Battalion of the 1st Regiment. There's probably no more difficult military maneuver than a withdrawal and contact to fight a covering force battle. That is an extremely complex operation and hazardous just by the definition. You're facing a far superior force, and you're supposed to buy time so the rest of your buddies can get out of there. Damn near suicidal. And so the 4th Battalion is fighting this fight. They're a good battalion. Excuse me. They run out of ammunition, they run out of water, they run out of food, they run out of medical supplies. The only damn thing they haven't run out of is North Vietnamese. We tried. We tried to help them, but we were foiled at every turn. The weather wouldn't permit us. Trying night sling load operations, trying to navigate in there, map and compass at night, you know, with no more ceiling than a couple 100 foot of ceiling. You know, you're gonna fly into a mountain just I mean, it's just a matter of time. And Air Force is doing their best to cover them with gunships, but by every time my Air Force gunships comes down out of cloud cover, they draw so damn much fire they have to go back up. Air Force loses contact with the battalion. Now we don't know where they're at. Then we get a call the next day that the battalion is split into two pieces. One piece is coming out with a sergeant. We think he's a sergeant. We only know that he has a call sign of Quebec. And there's going to be about 80 people with him, and the rest of that battalion has either been killed or they're splintering out and trying to escape the fate the best they can. But we do need to get this mountain to Quebec Whistler. And we never get it to them. And despite declaring a tactical emergency, we just can't get there from here. Meantime, all the other forces, South Vietnamese forces, are under tremendous military pressure. Getting shot at pretty bad. And it's not like we have a lot of free time to worry about this one battalion when we've got the best part of two divisions being destroyed at the same time. But him and his contingent make it to a bomb crater at the foot of that escarpment, really kind of on the side of the escarpment. And they're out of ammunition, out of hope, out of time. And a Cobra pilot by the name of Brandt finds him. And he's totally out of ammunition. But he tells a group of lift ships from the 223rd battalion, says, I'll take you to them. I'll show you the way. And so he circles around and leads them back in, gets hit on the way in, and keeps on going, because he hasn't got there yet. And he said, he makes out one more call. He says, they're on my mark. He means they're right under me now. And he turned back from the escarpment back down toward the river, burst into flames and crashed. When the 223rd went in to get him, they couldn't get in at one time. They got in with 2 ships, I believe. Both those ships came out carrying 25 or 30 South Vietnamese soldiers. Now, the UH-1 was designed to carry about 7 to 9, depending on what it was. So these UH-1s are terribly overloaded. And you got people hanging on to the outsides, hanging on to the skids. They're not cowards. They just plumb out. Those ships start losing power. Those air crews have to start pulling people off. Because some people will get off or everybody's going to die. It's that kind of situation. Retreat just becomes pure flight. It's just an unorganized route at this point. And U.S. Army helicopters pick up load after load after load. On the back of this book, General Ben Harrison says, in the final days of the operation, I watched the case on it. Every UH-1 helicopter returned fully loaded with withdrawing troops and an additional 4 to 6 armed and 8 containment off the skids. And he says, I've done a good job of describing the battle. Now, there's a picture of one skid rider. There were a lot of those guys that got on those skids, not all of them. All of them did that. Not all of them at all. So, that's Lamson 719. Now, why it failed? It failed in the planning. It assumed an enemy situation that was the same as 1968, when in fact it wasn't. There was a world of difference between the North Vietnamese Army in 1968, following the Tet Offensive, than there was in January of 1971. A big difference. We sent the South Vietnamese in there with M41 light tanks, and they were facing the Soviet built T-54 medium tanks. You know, it's like a pea shooter and a real pistol shooting at each other. We assumed, some of us did, in the higher levels of our government, that the enemy would just simply fall back in the face of assault, because that's what they had done in Cambodia. False assumption. Others of us assumed that the enemy had stand and fight. In fact, that they would pour all their reserves in it, but that was good, because it'd bring them out in the open, and then we could kill them with air power. That was a bad assumption. Air power, the state of the art, in 1971 wasn't going to allow you to do that. You know, the average F-4 dropping a dumb bomb in this environment, this was targeted about 1,000 meters. Just about 1,000 meter air. Okay. You know, whenever we started getting some laser guided bombs, even during this operation, we got to use a few of them, but not many. It made a lot of difference. But the Air Force wasn't built to go to war in this environment when this war started. Neither was the Army, neither was the Navy. The Air Force was built on the premise in 1960s and late 50s of a nuclear war. Its aircraft were designed to fly fast, fly straight, penetrate Soviet defenses, and drop a nuclear weapon and come home. One designed to support somebody down here in the weeds that needs fire support about 25 meters from his position. We had F-4s. That was the state-of-the-art fighter bomber for the United States Air Force. It didn't even have guns. It was armed only with air-to-air missiles. And then whatever you could hang on the wings as a dumb bomb. The really premier aircraft was the A-1, a propeller-driven Korean War vintage Navy aircraft that the Air Force latched onto. It could fly slow and it could fly low and it could carry a ton of munitions. But we never did buy any more of them. We just kind of used up what we had and then we saved the rest of them for SAR operations. We didn't even have forward air controllers when we started the war. We discovered that we needed them in World War II, and after World War II, we disbanded them, said we'll never need those guys again. Then along come Korean War, and we had to reorganize them and retrain them again. But after the Korean War, we said never going to need those guys again because the next war will be a nuclear war, and what do you need a forward air controller for a nuclear war for? So we had to invent them again in Vietnam, but guess what? The only airplane we had was a Korean War vintage 01 Bird Dog, basically a Cessna 150. They just get you killed very slowly. And then whenever we run out of them, we bought some Cessna Skymasters. Commercial off-the-shelf thing, had a pusher and a puller, tandem lined engines, 2 motors. That's great. One of them fails, the other one will get you right to where you're going to crash. Because they're going to fly down both of them. And it wasn't until the end of this war that we had to design forward air control aircraft, the old war. But, the Army wasn't even better off. 1960 rolled around, 1959, the Artillery's prized possession was atomic anti. Still see it sitting down Fort Sill, 280 millimeter cannon, reminiscent of the railway guns of World War II. You could take it down to Key West and bombard Cuba with it. Only thing is, you couldn't get it to Key West because it was too damn massive for the road system. You'd have probably sunk Key West if you'd have put it on there. Now, the infantry was not immune. Everybody wanted a piece of that nuclear pie. They had the Davy Crockett. Anybody tell me what the Davy Crockett is?
Sir, it's a very large recoilless rifle that fires a nuclear warhead.
Yeah. A nuclear recoilless rifle. So the front can stand out there and put that sucker up there and pop a nuke out there on the enemy. Biggest flaw was you couldn't get you couldn't get outside of the radiation hazard area if you were the guy pulling the trigger. So, that's the way we were designed in 1965. And that's one of the reasons that we decided that the best tactic in Laos was to see if we could get a neutral country there and just sort of withdraw from there if we could. Because about 3 days in office, Kennedy asked McNamara, can we do this? And McNamara said, sir, give me about a week to check and see what our forces look like. He came back about a week later and said, boss, we can't do this. We haven't got the airlift, we haven't got the sea lift. We don't have the right mix of forces, we don't have the right kind of aircraft to fight over war lines. So that was the war in Vietnam. There were insufficient forces available to the field commanders, air and ground. The United States Air Force had a tremendous capacity for destruction of the enemy, but was unable to use it because we were limited by financial considerations. And that's what we've got for Lamson 719.